So, I need to start out by explaining that with this admonition from the great satirist George Carlin, that I am not here representing the Obama administration, nor in my official capacity as Deputy Assistant Secretary. So I'm here more as a part-time professor at Yale. And the benefit of that is I didn't have to run my remarks by anybody, and I can tell you exactly what I think. So, I'm not with the government, so you can believe everything I say today. So this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about my vision. It's not just my vision. Many people, I think, share a concern for conservation and really where we need to go with conservation in the 21st century. Doing a better job of balancing uses, certainly working hard to restore the ecological integrity of our public lands. And I think in so doing has been highlighted in this wonderful meeting, demonstrating that we can also build resilience at the same time. So I guess the first thing I want to highlight is this has been fantastic for me. There was an article in the Sunday Times several weeks ago, which is my only relaxation these days, is reading the Sunday Times, as much as you can read in 1 hour, but anyway. There was a really good article that talked about the need to have time to ponder. Anybody see that article? And basically the thesis was the more we clutter our minds with day-to-day things and small projects, the more difficult it is for us to have the intellectual capability to deal with larger issues and do the kind of problem solving that CEOs, people like yourselves, government officials, I guess like me, should be doing. And I don't know about you, but I spend a lot of time day to day just run. So this has been a fantastic opportunity to listen and learn and ponder. So I really appreciate that. And there's no better place to do this. I also learned a great deal. I'm not in the finance field. My bank account would demonstrate that. But I was pleased to hear some of the things that I'm going to talk about today. I think some of what I'm going to talk about will kind of get teed up by the presentations yesterday and this morning. But I was also pleased and interested to hear some of the comments from people who work in the finance field that reflect, I guess, things that I've been thinking about. So maybe I know more about finance than I thought. I doubt that, but anyway. So it was great to hear Paul talk about land use as a critical component in drawdown. And I mean, those of us who have worked in conservation, and I have for 35 years, intuitively know that. We've just never had someone of such stature verify it for us, so that helps a great deal. Colin's comments about nature, obviously I'm going to hit on that hard in my presentation. I was pleased to hear about the transition to a low-carbon economy as the greatest investment opportunity in the future, and I want to touch on that because I think it really is. I appreciated Peter Knight's comments about market forces having too short a time frame and focus. I mean, I work in the conservation business, and we are supposed to have a long time frame. We're supposed to think in terms of decades and centuries. The problem is only sometimes do we have the luxury of doing that, given the political pressures that we deal with. I was also pleased to hear him say that sustainability analysis should be mainstream. That certainly should be the case for the work we do in conservation. I was also pleased to hear about the challenges in the finance community in dealing with custom and culture, traditional ways of doing things. I deal with this every day. I'm sure all of us have our own experiences with that. But I like to focus on the critical role of terminology. Impact investment versus purposeful investment. It's funny when I hear people here talk about infrastructure, my sense is that generally you're still talking about roads and bridges and transmission lines and other things. I think of green infrastructure. I think of trees, wetland restoration. I think of soil remediation. To me, that's infrastructure. So there are differences, but there are similarities all the same. I've also come to learn, and I got a sense of this in the conversations the past 2 days, how important words are. Talking about investment as a great opportunity is a great example of that. I've learned over time, too many times, to not use the word change, particularly when I sit down with a community in the West. We talk about public land management. I mean, that's the death knell for any conversation. So what I try to do is not talk about change. And it's hard to convince someone who lives off the land and has lived for generations in a particular place that before them is a great opportunity. That brings to mind the Carlin comment that I showed you right up front from them, I can assure you. What I talk about is innovation. You know, there's ways to innovate the way we do business. There's ways to work better together. There's ways to think about problems in a different way. And innovation seems to have a more positive connotation to it. And I think that helps get people to focus on what the opportunities are ahead. I tend to be very outcome focused, be very clear about that. If anybody who doesn't know me doubts my commitment to conservation and my desire to make sure that, you know, when I'm done doing whatever it is I'm doing, that these landscapes are in better shape than they were when I first started doing what I'm doing. I've been very lucky to work on some big projects. Lucky may not be the right word. Like the Northwest Forest Plan to help protect 58 million acres of roadless areas across the U.S. And now to work on sage grouse. And it's the sage grouse experience that has actually brought to light for me some of the critical elements that need to be the foundation for this 21st century conservation vision. That's what I'm going to talk about. But one thing I do want to emphasize, Colin talked about this, and I appreciated Rick's comments. I don't know if Rick is here, but Rick is probably out having lunch, smart man. He talked about trees, and he said, well, who would have the audacity to reinvent a tree, right? So when I think of technology, it's not the kind of technology that most of you invest in, although I need to learn more about green bonds. You know, it is the technology that we have before us that is centuries old. I mean, what is better than nature as technology? So think about that. It's incredibly sophisticated, right? And we're talking about whole systems here, integrated in ways that we still don't quite understand, but seem to work very well. Trees, as a great example, certainly reflect advanced engineering. More than anything, nature has been tested over time, right? In fact, I think nature and time go hand in hand because nature's been around since the beginning of time. So we ought to learn from those experiences. We ought to think about how we utilize these assets and these resources most effectively. So that's part of what I want to address today. So trees are a tremendous asset from the standpoint of providing watershed protection, watershed health, habitat, climatic impacts, and obviously as banks for storing carbon. So to our rangelands. Rangelands play an important role, not well recognized role in terms of their sequestration benefits, and so do wetlands. Wetlands actually play a significant role, and I won't get into the numbers. Many of you probably know this, but this is important though. So if we're going to talk about a new agenda for conservation, we ought to reflect and respect the agenda that was put together over a century ago. So this is obviously Teddy Roosevelt, many people think of as the father of conservation. And I think this is a particularly important comment in light of what we're discussing today. I mean, basically it says we have an obligation to protect these assets and to use them wisely, not in a wasteful way, and benefit generations to come. I don't think anyone would deny that. But I think it puts into perspective what it is we need to try to achieve. And it introduces this element of time, because the true measure of our success will only be realized by my children's children. And I am proud to say that my youngest daughter, a Smith graduate, is now working for the Forest Service. So my oldest daughter is going to make more money than my youngest daughter, though. So I'll make this easy on you. I do teach part-time at Yale, so I'll give you the takeaways up front, and then we can do the quiz at the end of the session. So first takeaway, public lands are significant. They're 1/3 of the American landscape. They really are. Their integrity, their ecological health really is fundamental to maintaining ecological integrity and all the benefits that accrue from that. And those benefits really are improved climate resilience, improved carbon sequestration, and improved ecosystem services. You know, water quality and quantity, wildlife habitat, whole host of things. Second, ecological integrity can be achieved by a number of means, and this is kind of the toolkit, if you will, for this second century conservation strategy. The first is identifying, mapping, and protecting healthy lands. I'll get into that. Second kind of component of this is mitigation, trying to avoid or minimize adverse impacts. Third is restoration. I think that's fairly simple. We talk about reforestation a bit. And then finally, one that's a little bit different, and that's what I call reconciliation. And that is trying to take projects, activities that are likely to cause high conflict and be to the detriment of other values, move those in places where they're going to create less conflict and actually provide greater certainty, the potential for development. That's a particular concern with regard to energy development on public lands. So, those of you who are from Sun Valley, come to visit Sun Valley, realize the benefits of public lands. You have the blessings of the Sawtooth National Forest here. You have the SNRA just over the mountain, almost over the mountain, and then over the mountain. Fantastic place, and I come here to vacation as much as I can, mainly because of the SNRA and what a unique resource it is. And then there are also Bureau of Land Management lands within this kind of larger system. Incredible assets. I mean, think about how unique the United States is to have these assets at our disposal. And we all own them, every one of us in this room. I work for all of you. And that can be challenging at times, but it is an honor and really a unique privilege to play that role. I'm responsible with my colleagues, and some of whom are actually in the room and worked with me before. Brooks Preston had the misfortune of being my chief of staff for many years, but we survived. He's actually doing better than I am, you can tell. But the honor, the pleasure, the responsibility to manage these assets for the American public and for generations to come, to do what Teddy Roosevelt said we ought to do. And I take that very seriously. So, this is the public estate, if you will. These are the public lands. 1/3 of the nation's landscape is publicly owned. It's administered by Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service. There are DOD lands in there. I think there are also Indian trust lands, etc. So it's a huge chunk of the American landscape. Again, a uniquely American concept. I realize the national parks are America's best idea. I've never worked on the parks. I've worked on public lands, and I got to tell you, they're pretty fantastic too. So why do we have these lands? I think it's just important to understand this. So these were the lands that were left over that nobody wanted. So when the homesteaders went west and they, identified their plot of land where they wanted to develop, well, they got that. As an incentive to promote the expansion of railroads from the east to the west and ultimately from the west to the east, the railroads were granted alternative sections of land on either side of the right-of-way on which they built the land. And that's what leads to this checkerboard ownership. Oh, look at that. Technology, isn't that amazing? So that checkerboard ownership, you can see the mix between public lands and private lands. That complicates life immensely. And then 1872 Mining Act basically allowed individuals to stake claims anywhere they wanted on the public domain. Actually, unfortunately, it still does. And that, you can imagine, makes things quite complicated. The only exclusion to that is where lands are actually withdrawn from mineral entry by the Secretary of the Interior. And we've actually proposed to do some of that on a number of, in a number of situations in recent years, and have proposed the withdrawal of some lands to provide for protection of greater sage grouse. So this is the public landscape. What can I say? It's the West. And that creates great opportunity and causes great controversy. And I get the benefit of both. These lands are important in providing a lot of goods and services. Obviously, timber, rangeland use, grazing is still the dominant use in most western rangelands. Energy production, significant. and a challenge to manage at times. Non-traditional energy production, which we hope will become more traditional energy production. Solar and wind. Recreation. Recreation, we're coming to realize, is an important value, an important service provided by the public lands. I mean, Sun Valley wouldn't exist if that opportunity weren't here. It's hard for me to imagine all of you mining out there somewhere. So, and in fact, Secretary Jewell announced, I want to say a month or so ago, that the Department of Commerce will start to now gather statistics on outdoor recreation, as they do for other sectors of the economy, to track its value in the U.S. economy. In 2015, about $41 billion in economic output was associated with recreation on the public lands, and it produced over 350,000 jobs. So it's significant, a significant part of the equation, if you will. These lands are also important because they sequester carbon. There's about 750 million acres of forest in the United States. About 44% is publicly owned, and about 3/4 of that is administered by federal agencies. About those lands, forest lands in total, sequester about 250 million tons of carbon annually. So that's significant in many respects. Also important to recognize that rangelands, and we're probably talking mainly these areas here, the rangelands also provide an important carbon stock, about close to 20 million tons a year associated with rangeland conservation. Here's the challenge, though. These lands are under stress. So, for me, I think what I've learned over 35 years at this, I'm older than I look, is that the Wild West is no longer wild. Yet our policies reflect the notion that, in fact, it still is. 1872 Mining Act, the way we lease oil and gas. In fact, until very recently, how we lease right-of-ways for renewable energy development. It's basically driven by the notion that if you're interested in developing it, then it is the obligation of the Bureau of Land Management to make that available to you. And I think that's good for commerce, but it throws out of whack the potential to balance all these multiple uses and ensure that these lands are managed to maximize all the values that they can generate. So these landscapes are under stress for other reasons too. This is a statistic similar to one you heard yesterday about forests, but every 2.5 minutes the West loses a football field-sized chunk of land. So we're losing land to various factors. Development is certainly one. Renewable energy creates its stresses on public lands. When actually it was before I started the Interior Department, there was virtually no renewable energy development on public lands. But since 2009, we've permitted 59 renewable energy projects, wind, solar, and geothermal. And when they finally all get online, assuming most will, about 15,000 megawatts of power will be generated. So that's a rather recent and significant change in the use of public lands, and it, as I said, creates its own stresses. But here's the real stressor, if you will. It's climate change. And what this slide illustrates is that over, comparing these two time periods, 48 to 80 and 1981 to 2014, temperature rise, which is shown in the graphic at the bottom, in some parts of the West has been as high as 2 degrees already. That leads to all kinds of impacts and implications. Wildfire, invasive species, drought, and other stresses on this landscape. One example, rangeland fire, which has a devastating effect on western rangelands, on rural communities. Cattle ranchers can be completely burned out of their operations. Rural communities can suffer the consequences when there's no business left because they've lost these landscapes. And this is particularly pernicious and a threat to greater sage grouse. So it was something we had to deal with in the context of the work that we did. And in fact, Secretary Jewell issued a secretarial order, Secretarial Order 3336. It's pretty bad when you memorized all these numbers. which set in place a whole new strategy for dealing with rangeland fire in a collaborative way, working with the states, working with local communities, funding investments in rangeland fire protection associations and rural fire departments, and actually hiring 200 vets. And these veterans are now trained as firefighters as a part of this program. It's been quite successful. The biggest threat, though, that comes with climate change is the changes in habitat that occur, which can be driven by things like fire, or simply by the demands for other land uses. And monarch butterfly is a great example of one of those species that could become threatened or endangered as a result of those changes in land use. Oh, there's this other threat too, which I couldn't help but bring up. How many of you heard of the Malheur refuge takeover? Everybody, right? So this is a real threat. And there's a philosophy among some in the Congress that they want their lands back. The fact of the matter is they were never their lands. They've always been our lands. And it's unfortunate to have to deal with this. I had a hearing last week that focused in, I think, to some degree on this issue. It was uncomfortable because there was clearly a difference in perspective or philosophy. I won't get into the details, but this is real. And it is a real threat that has to be addressed. So the challenge is, how do we meet the goods and services, produce the goods and services, and meet the needs of rural communities, important industries, and at the same time ensure that we protect these resources for generations to come. Reinvest in these resources to realize the benefits that they can provide. Well, the answer, and this sounds maybe too professorial, it's ecological integrity. What does that mean? Well, it basically means maintaining and restoring the functional attributes of these systems. Not just one component or another, but actually maintaining the integrity of these systems so they operate in a way that they have done historically, or at least within the range of variation, changes in temperature, climate, and other factors over time. So I'm going to try to characterize this in a different way. So I have my Fitbit on. In a manner of speaking, what we're trying to do is just what you do when you exercise, when you improve your diet, when you get out and hike. We want to build fitness for these ecosystems. And we do that in a number of ways, but ultimately that's what it's about. In fact, I would suggest to you that the concepts are essentially the same, except in one instance we're talking about an organism, you. In another we're talking about an entire system and the organisms associated with it. Those same concepts can be applied to natural areas in rangeland, forested ecosystems, as they apply to you and I. And you get more remarkable results. You can see this is a restoration project for a riparian area. They come back. And if I ran a little more, I'd probably feel better too. But they do come back. And it makes a big difference. And so we know that this technology, this reinvestment in restoration, works because obviously, the repaired riparian area on the right is more fit and robust, will provide for greater biodiversity, will keep that stream temperature cooler, and is sequestering a heck of a lot more carbon than the rocks on the other side. So, the elements of conservation in the 21st century: work at a landscape level, improve our application and use of science as a foundation for making prudent policy decisions. That is a challenge. And collaborative conservation. And collaboration has been discussed by a number of people here today. The four elements I talked about earlier: protection, mitigation, restoration, reconciliation. I'll just talk a little bit more about those. So, protecting public lands, why is that important? Well, what's interesting is if you look at, this is the percent loss of habitat type, and green is minimal loss up to red. You can see that these public lands are largely still intact. We haven't lost a lot of those ecosystems. So we start from a much better position than if we had to restore these landscapes here. So I think that's one of the benefits of focusing on public lands, and one of the reasons it's important to consider how we reinvest in them. But here's another factor, and that is the areas of high protection. And you can see that these lands, by and large, are not as well protected. Protection in this case is allowing normal ecological function to occur. So it tends naturally to focus in then on wilderness areas. Notice Sun Valley is right about there. So the SNRA is here with the Sawtooth Wilderness and now the Boulder White Clouds Wilderness area. Similarly, these areas here, mountainous areas and the like. But they're largely intact. And that's an important element to consider. So the first thing we do in trying to implement this agenda is we want to identify the areas that warrant protection. And we do that through designations. For example, wilderness. This is the Boulder White Clouds Wilderness area, which I hope to get up into some point in time. To the upper left is the Craters of the Moon National Monument. To the lower right is the Staircase Escalante National Monument in Utah. So identifying these areas, providing protected status for these areas is an important first step and critically important for kind of anchoring a larger conservation strategy. Unfortunately, it's not enough. That's the problem. Because despite our efforts to try to protect species like this, we know these activities are going to happen on these lands. They have to happen. They have to happen to maintain commerce, to provide the raw materials we need for the things we talked about yesterday. Lithium. You mine lithium. Well, you mine lithium on these western landscapes. And so we know these landscapes are going to be used. So I want to offer two examples, though, of how we can minimize the impacts of that development. So first one will be a solar project. This is actually the first big solar project on public lands. Everybody probably knows this is Ivanpah, solar thermal project. When finally completed, it had a big landscape impact, huge impact. Now, I can't help but imagine that when this was first conceived, that the presumption was that this desert environment just southwest of Las Vegas was largely devoid of significant biological value. It was desert. It was kind of wasteland. Well, as the developers soon found out that was not the case, they ran into something called the desert tortoise, which I think is still a threatened species. And they had to figure out ways in which they could limit the impacts to those desert tortoise. And that required us to think about different solutions and different strategies for how we would actually locate solar energy in the future. So what we did was, and this was a 2-year project, and actually I have to credit David Hayes for the initiative here, who was then the Undersecretary of Interior. We created solar zones, solar energy zones. So these zones, all located here, were areas that were identified through a huge landscape level process for their high potential for solar and their limited conflict with other values and uses, whether they were ecological values, whether they were cultural values or the like, and a public process was initiated to identify these. These solar zones have turned out to be quite popular. The first solar zone, Dry Lake here, was auctioned off for future solar development just last year. And the auction generated the highest bid premiums of any solar project that we'd done. Was $6 million for six different lease holdings in the area. So the beauty of this, and it's important to note, is what this does is it reduces conflict and produces certainty in two ways. Certainty that we can achieve, we have more potential to achieve our ecological outcomes, the conservation goals that we have, and certainty for the project developer that they can move forward here with the hope of fewer additional environmental reviews, fewer delays in the process of permitting, and hopefully lower litigation risk. So it's a win-win. And it's a process we're continuing. In fact, we're looking at new zones because of the increased interest in zones. Now I want to talk about another example of how we're trying to deal with this issue of the impacts on western landscapes. So obviously this is oil and gas leasing. I'm not sure where it is, but I'm glad I'm not there. What's important to know here is that currently the oil and gas industry in the United States has 32 million acres under lease. And about 12 million of those are in production. And production can mean full field production to a couple of barrels a day. But that's the situation. And what's interesting about that is that we continue to lease. In 2015, we put up for auction 4 million acres for lease, and about 15% was bid on. Now, I alluded to this earlier, but the way this process works is, well, I'll get to this in a second, but the way this process works is a developer, a company comes in to a BLM office and says, I want to lease the area over here. The BLM will go through a process and ultimately decide whether or not they want to move forward with the lease. They'll prepare an environmental assessment. They'll do their analysis. They'll put this out for public comment. Sometimes the lease moves forward, oftentimes. Sometimes the proposed lease sale areas are modified. It costs on average between $220,000 and $250,000 to prepare a lease package. So it's a pretty expensive operation. So imagine putting all that work into 4 million acres of lease sales and only having 15% purchase. Now that reflects obviously current market conditions, but it's a factor that comes into play. So we had to worry about this issue of leasing in the context of the sage-grouse debate, and this is just a map of past and current sage-grouse habitat. When I first got involved in this, I read this editorial in the Wall Street Journal. Now, I have to admit I don't read the Wall Street Journal very often. I read the New York Times. And I realize you can read both, but... So this was fascinating. So this was the editorial from the Wall Street Journal. And it said, will Obama use two small birds to limit oil drilling in the West? So this is a period of time earlier in the Obama administration when it was all of the above in terms of energy production and leasing and opportunity. And yet this was the kind of the threat that was out there. And I kind of scratched my head and I said, come on now, really? Is that, I mean, I knew that was not really what was going on, but the question was, are there really conflicts between oil and gas and sage-grouse? Or is this the Wall Street Journal? So I had someone, what we call our National Operations Center, young wildlife biologist who also is a GIS expert, do an analysis for me. And basically what we did was we mapped oil and gas potential. These are the different colors. So, it was map potential in relation to habitat. So the orange, yellow color is priority habitat, blue is general, and green is non-habitat. Now, obviously, what you want to do is you want to develop in the non-habitat. You want to limit the development in priority habitat. Why? Because sage-grouse hate disturbance. I mean, they're a species that has lived on rangelands before you and I were here, and they don't like disturbance. And a lot of research would show that as a result of disturbance, they'll often not breed. They'll leave their leks, which is where they breed. And if you've never seen that before, you want to check it out. It's the most amazing thing you'll ever see. So we did this analysis, and lo and behold, what we found was, and again, this is mainly Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah. These are the areas where the leasing activity has been the greatest. What we found was that 85% of the high and medium potential oil and gas wasn't even under sage-grouse habitat. Didn't seem to jibe with that editorial. So we did some further analysis. We really did. I swear we did. Oh, wait, come back. So, and as one example, we looked at each state. So we looked at Utah as an example. And here's what we found. Certainly there's leasing going on. The crosshatch areas are the habitat areas we're worried about. There's certainly leasing going on. These areas are leased in priority habitat. There's some development already occurring here. But the areas are not completely overwhelmed by standing leases or development. In fact, there's quite a bit of leasing and development that's occurred outside of habitat areas. That's what the green represents. And that's where we want it to be. So then we looked at oil and gas potential in non-habitat areas, and look how much is high potential outside of those habitat areas. It's pretty awesome. That's where we want to go. So then we stepped back and we took a larger look. And lo and behold, what we found was that nearly 2/3 of the high potential oil and gas was in non-habitat. About 3/4 of the medium potential was in non-habitat. and almost 90% of the low potential was in non-habitat. So fully, if you look across this line in non-habitat, you can see there's 3 times as much non-habitat high potential than there is priority habitat. And I could go on, but the point is, we can avoid these problems if we're just smart about what we do. And instead of allowing things to continue the way they've continued, what we can actually do is we can sit down with the industry, we can sit down with the conservation community, we can sit down with the scientists who know a lot more about this than I, and we can design schemes to lease in different places. And if there's a desire to lease, under habitat, well, then we can use technology, right? And we can actually use directional drilling. Now, by the way, I'm sorry, this is from an older slide. So this guy's name is Willie Keeler. Anybody have any idea what Willie Keeler is known for? Well, he's a Hall of Fame baseball player. He played in the early 1900s, actually late 1800s to early 1900s. He batted 313 straight seasons, and 316 of his 19 seasons that he played ball. And in 1897, he batted .424. What Willie Keeler is known for is a saying, and the saying he's known for is, he was asked by sports writers, so how come you're so good? How come your batting average is so high? And he said, I keep my eye on the ball, and I hit them where they ain't. Well, the same philosophy ought to apply to what we do with oil and gas leasing, right? And we can do this, I'm going to back up, we can do this in 2 ways. So when oil and gas prices are extremely low as they are now, and development is minimal, if we're going to continue to lease, and by the way, we have to by law. I want to be clear, this is not at the discretion of BLM. We are required by the Energy Policy Act of 2005 to offer quarterly oil and gas leases. And we dutifully do that, whether or not they're bought. In fact, what's really frightening is if they're not bought in auction, those landscapes are available for lease at $2 an acre for 2 years to follow. And those leases last for 10 years. So we're committing those leased lands to oil and gas development for 10 years. Now, if I understood what I heard yesterday from some of our colleagues, the future of oil and gas is on the decline. So one would, I think, ask a question, why then would we commit these lands for the next 10 years to a use that may or may not be necessary? Nevertheless, as I said, as prices go up, because directional drilling costs money, well then there's a way to access those resources under existing habitat. Before I go to this, I just want to make one other point, and that is, I'm not trying to suggest that we shouldn't do oil and gas leasing. If that's what the market demands, if the interest is there and there are a lot of other uses for it, well, so be it. But we ought to be smart about how we do it, and we ought to think about how we create greater certainty. The example I used for solar is a good one. How do we ensure that if we're going to develop oil and gas, we develop in the right places, we concentrate the development to minimize surface disturbance, we direct the infrastructure necessary to support it to those right places, and then we can protect the rest. And that provides greater certainty and lower cost for the project developers, and it provides the public greater return on investment and lower cost, as opposed to preparing packages for lease at $250,000 a package. And I think most importantly, it gives us greater certainty that we can meet our mission in managing these landscapes for all the values that are associated with them by being more prudent in how we guide development. So there are other opportunities. I talked about restoration. Restoration is certainly an important element in the portfolio of conservation and linked to resilience in carbon sequestration. In 2015, the Forest Service estimated that about 1.2 million acres of land needed reforestation. Now, I'm quite certain that's areas that are previously harvested. There are millions of more acres that are in need of restoration or improvement due to forest health impacts, fire impacts, and the like. They were successful last year in getting funding to reforest 200,000 acres. But they're never going to catch up. So a real opportunity for carbon sequestration and building resilience is the reinvestment in reforestation on public lands. I mentioned fire. This provides another important opportunity. There are places where fire risk is so great that we do need to go in and we need to thin these areas, we need to remove dead and dying timber. That again provides an opportunity for reforestation and accelerating climate, our efforts to deal with climate through sequestration. And what I love about it is the technology is pretty simple. It works. It works very well. So the other thing we need to deal with in terms of restoration is we need to curb the influx of invasive species. I'm sure many of you are familiar with cheatgrass. Too familiar with cheatgrass. It is a scourge across the West, expanding rapidly, in part accelerated by the impacts of increasing temperatures. But what's really bad about cheatgrass is it flourishes early in the season and it dries out and it creates this incredible fuel bed for fire. And as a result, many rangeland fires are a function of the extent to which cheatgrass has entered an area. And rangeland fire, if you don't know, can be incredibly devastating. We had a fire last week that moved 5,000 acres every 5 minutes. And fortunately, they got on it and limited the damage, but it did impact priority sage-grouse habitat, and now the restoration work will begin. This is the kind of restoration work we do in those rangeland areas. This is part of an experimental project in a place called the Soda Fire Complex. It was a fire between Oregon and Washington. And we're now working, actually developed an initiative called the Native Seed Initiative, in which we are gathering native seed from across these landscapes for the sole purpose of being able to restore these landscapes to their natural balance in an ecologically sound way. So, last thing I want to talk about is reconciliation. And I know this map is very confusing, but this is Montana, and I'm sure you can all read that. These are every well location in Montana. Now, these aren't all active wells. These include every well that the Board of Oil and Gas in Montana has tracked and monitored. And the concern here is this is priority habitat, these gray areas. This is priority habitat. In fact, this area is so important. The Fish and Wildlife Service asked us to protect these areas and withdraw them from oil and gas leasing in the future. They were called sagebrush focal areas. And they're really the anchor for the strategy that the Fish and Wildlife Service determined was adequate to ensure that the species didn't need to be listed. So the problem is, where these are active leases or wells, how do we get them out of here and move them someplace else? And the someplace else are these areas. This is high and medium oil and gas potential. And these are areas obviously outside of priority habitat. Well, one way to do that is to provide an incentive for the current holders of those leases to get out. Another potential way is to buy them out. The federal government doesn't have the money to do that, nor probably the inclination, I hate to say. But if we started to reconcile some of these problems, we could accelerate the restoration of these areas, the ecological and climate benefits that are associated with them. This is actually what our sage-grouse work has been about. It's less about sage-grouse than it's the sagebrush ecosystem, which is, according to experts, the most imperiled ecosystem in the United States. And it supports 350 species, not just the sage-grouse. So the work we're doing now is not only to bring back the sage-grouse, but to ensure that in the future we don't have to repeat this species after species after species. That's part of landscape conservation, an important concept that we're trying to advance. So I want to wrap things up by thinking about these two gentlemen. Teddy Roosevelt, who knows who's on the right? Very good, that was easy. You passed the quiz. So, they worked hard together to create the concept, to advance the notion of conservation as an important value and an important part of American culture. And I think they were very successful in that regard, and I think we are realizing, particularly out here, the legacy of their thoughtful commitment to conservation years ago. This is what Roosevelt said at that time. I like this quote for a number of reasons, but I really like it because it's actually etched in stone inside the American Museum of Natural History in Manhattan, in New York. which when I was a kid growing up in Fort Lee, New Jersey, was like Mecca, which is probably why I got into conservation. I had a senator ask me when I was going through confirmation hearings for my position at USDA when Brooks and I worked together. He said, Jim, you're from New Jersey. What the hell do you know about public lands? And I honestly told him, I said, Senator, I know there's something special, and I will do everything I can to make sure they're here for generations to come. And he voted for me, which was remarkable. So I do want to wrap up by highlighting this. So why the focus on public lands in the context of resilience and in all this conference is about? Well, it's for a couple of reasons, reflecting on some of what was said yesterday, particularly by the pothead and the jarhead at the very end, which I thought was a very inspirational comment. So why focus on public lands? Well, as I tried to illustrate, first of all, they're in relatively good shape. From an ecological standpoint, they're intact, and they are, with some exceptions, a good place to start because of their ecological fitness. A second reason is that that I think working on public lands, working in collaboration with communities, developers, et cetera, we can develop win-win scenarios. As I said, for solar and for oil and gas and for other uses. If we sit down and figure out ways to look at this vast landscape and use the pieces of this landscape to the highest and best use, I think we're going to come out ahead. I think another reason is I think there's a new investment opportunity here. Now, I can't say that. I'm not an investor, but I've already asked Brooks and his wife to give me a tutorial on conservation finance and investing in public lands, and I think there's real potential here. In fact, the department recently set up an Office of Conservation Finance, brought in someone from the finance community who has done very well for himself and retired young, but wants to give something back, and so he's working with us on developing strategies for investment. So I think there's real potential here, and I think it's significant to focus on public lands because it is 1/3 of the landscape. So it's a huge area with diverse landscapes to pilot test different ideas, different strategies to deal with different problems, and hopefully demonstrate our ability to develop different solutions together. And that collaboration is critical, and it was one of the benefits for me of coming to this meeting. I guess the other thing I wanted to say with regard to public lands is the reason we should do this on public lands is because we own these lands. They're our lands. And as Gifford Pinchot said many, many years ago, he's the first head of the Forest Service and was a close compatriot of Teddy Roosevelt. He said the national forests are significant, but he said, but for them to have any meaning, the owners of those forests, the public, had to make their views known and be very, very active in doing so. So here's an opportunity for us to stand up and say, look, we can manage these lands better. We can have access to resources. We can have better recreation. We can have better water quality. We can improve wildlife habitat. We can invest in these lands for the benefit of all. And we should lead by example. That was the point that Puck made at the very end. And I'm not going to tell you about the head and blah, 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 but he said lead by example. And I think that's really important. Because I think if we don't lead by example, this is what happens. And if that happens, it's lights out. So thank you.